everyone, this is Mrs. Gelling, and in this video we are going to review Module 1, Lessons 4 through 6, where we will be learning about principles of design. So as always, our goal by the end of this video is to be able to explain what the principles of design are and identify them in a piece of art. We are going to use what we are learning about the principles of design to be able to analyze art pieces and identify or explain how artists use these elements and principles of design effectively. So to start, we just want to recap here that Module 1 for Art Appreciation, we are learning about the parts of artworks. What makes up art and how artists use these various techniques to create their masterpieces. So what we are learning in Module 1 will help us analyze art pieces for our critical thinking questions, as well as carrying those skills into the real world. And that is called formal analysis. So we are going to be analyzing art throughout the rest of this class. We covered elements of art at the beginning of this module, and so now we are going to jump into principles of design. So to start, we're going to talk about balance. Balance is the equal distribution of elements throughout an art piece. When we think of balance, we can sometimes think of those scales where you put equal weight on the right and left side to keep them balanced, right? Equal to each other. In art, we judge balance visually. So in balance in artwork, we usually draw an imaginary line that either goes vertical or horizontal through a piece of artwork down the center. And then we look at each side of that imaginary line. And there are three types of balance that we can observe in art. So first we have symmetrical balance. That's that left-hand side here. So symmetrical balance, that word also might sound familiar from math, right? Where if we draw our imaginary line, in this case vertically down the center, we see that the left side and the right side look the same. For this tree, it's the mirror opposites, right? But we still have the same shapes, the same colors happening on either side of that imaginary line. That is symmetrical balance. We also have asymmetrical balance, which we can observe in that middle painting here. So when we look at this vertical line, our yellow line, imaginary line, we can see that each side looks different. On the right, we have the woman sitting in the chair, and on the left, we can see her feet on the ground, and then that curtain that's hanging on the wall there. So while these don't match, we do see a balance. There's a lot of black happening towards like the bottom left-hand corner, the woman's dress on the right-hand side. And then when we look at the left side, we have a really dark black rectangle that's coming from the top down. So it makes it look balanced even though they don't match. And last, we have radial balance. And that type of balance is where we have repeated patterns that circle and move outwards from the center. So we see a lot of radial balance being used in Islamic art. In this case of the mosque that we're looking at here, the roof of the mosque, we can see that the pattern radiates from the center. It repeats and circles around that center blue circle and then what is inside. So that is radial balance. We draw the line, it matches on either side, but we could also draw the yellow line horizontal and also have the same top and bottom. So radial balance. We also have repetition and rhythm. So these are two different principles of design, but they do tend to work together. So repetition is the repeating of a visual element. It could be lines, colors, shapes, and or textures. So repetition is generally used to highlight the importance of various elements or to bring a composition together. It also helps guide our eyes around the piece of art that we are looking at. So going off of that, we also have rhythm, where rhythm uses repetition to help the audience or the viewer look at a piece of art and guide their eyes through the art piece. So when we are looking at rhythm, for example, in this Van Gogh painting of blue irises here, we can see the repeated blue iris going horizontally across the canvas. That helps guide our eye. We're generally going to look at this art piece left to right. We're following those blue flowers, and then we may go back, right? Our eye might be drawn to the white iris on the left-hand side, and then we'll look at the background with the different flowers and maybe the ground where we can see the soil. But again, rhythm uses repetition to help us look at the canvas completely. And repetition on its own is just the repeating of any visual element. So in this case, we see the image of the man raining from the sky, all over different perspectives, far away, up close, but still repeating that same object. So now we are going to take a look at proportion. So proportion, you might also have heard that word from math, right? Does anyone remember what a proportion is in math? Where we are comparing two units of measure, right? So $4 per pound or 2/3 of a pie. Proportion in art, we talk about scale or the size of different objects, shapes, that are in a painting. And this helps us also create a sense of depth. So in this case, we can look at these three art pieces here. On the left, we have the School of Athens. It's a little blurry because I tried to zoom in as best as I could. And we can see the scale here. All the figures, all the human figures look the same size. And then the building that's in the background, while it's painted smaller to look farther away. So we are using an equal scale to show the depth of a painting. We can also compare the human figures in the middle mosaic from the Byzantine Empire, as well as the Rococo painting of the woman with the lamb here. We can also compare the size of the human figures to the animals. In this case, those are realistic scales. More or less, if the people were that size, the animals would probably be about that same size in real life. So the proportion in these paintings bring a realistic quality to this, in that the sizes generally match what would be happening in the real world. Now, we also can have disproportionate or out of proportion objects and figures in paintings, and that could be done on purpose or maybe not. So in this case, we have a surrealist painting down below, or composition rather, where we have that giant human head and then a really small human figure. And this is also different because that really giant human head is farther back. It's in the background of the painting, not in the foreground, where usually larger objects are closer in the foreground to make it look closer to the audience. And so that causes us to focus first on that giant head, and then we're like, what is she looking at? We're going to follow that. What is that called? The imaginary line, where we're looking at the eyes, what the eyes are looking at. Starts with an I. Implied lines, right? So those eyes are looking at that running human figure. Our eyes are going to follow where that giant human head is looking. We also can observe disproportionate or out of scale objects with cave paintings. These animals and the humans look like they're the same size when probably the animals were a little bit bigger than the human figures in general. And then we also have this painting at the end here where we have very disproportionate scales. These horses have very giant legs. The buildings are on top of the horses. So they're painted much smaller than the animals. And then we have the human figure that also has very disproportionate. His arms are very long compared to his body. And so that's just pulling our focus and emphasizing different figures and objects in the painting. So when you're looking at proportion, we can compare the sizes and how well or maybe not well it contributes to the art piece. So next we are going to take a look at movement. So movement gives the artwork a sense of action. We want to describe movement in terms of how it helps the viewer look at the piece as a whole, and as well as does movement tell a story in the art piece. So we have three general types of movements that we can analyze in an art piece. The first one is optical movement. So this is the kind of artwork where if you look at it and you look at it long enough, it starts to look like it's moving. Van Gogh is very well known for his optical movement painting style for most of his artworks. So Starry Night, if you stare at it long enough, the sky might start to swirl with those paint strokes. That is an optical illusion, optical movement. We also have repetition as a type of movement. So when we're repeating similar objects, they tend to create a sense of motion. So in this case, we have these spheres that are repeated and also a little bit of radial balance, right? We're around that central figure of that face, and then they're going out and they look like they're kind of spinning as well, moving away from the center and spinning a little bit. So we have repeated objects giving us this sense of rotation or movement in the art piece. And last but not least, we also have suggested movement. This one is probably one of the easier ones to find or analyze in an art piece. And that's just where the artist tried to capture a movement in motion in the painting. So in this case, we can tell that this woman that's on the swing is swinging back and forth, right? And we can see that she kicked off her shoe, and so her shoe is flying through the air. Now she's not actually moving, but we get a sense of motion. It's suggested based on how she is painted, that we can see that there is motion happening, even if the artist just captured one moment in time. So now we also have emphasis as one of our principles of design. And emphasis simply refers to the focal point of the art piece. What are we looking at first? And why? What makes it look important? What draws our attention to that? Is it the use of color? Is it the size? Or is it the light? So in this case, we have three types of emphasis. We have the size, right? So we have these human figures pulling this ship ashore. They're painted larger, so it draws our focus in first to the foreground, and then we look at the background as to we see the ship and the ocean. So the emphasis are the people pulling the ship, and they're painted larger, right? That also gives us a sense of proportion. We're seeing a good use of scale here. But the emphasis in terms of size, people are painted larger than everything else in the painting, so that draws our attention first to them. We also have this middle painting here, the Birth of Venus, where in this case, all the figures are looking at Venus in the center here. So we have the goddess on the left with the red shawl. Her arms are pointed towards the figure as well as she's looking at the figure. And then the nymph and the god on the other side are flying towards her, and the wind is blowing towards her and they're looking at her. So we're following the lines, the implied lines, right? Imaginary lines that are pointed towards that middle canvas. And last but not least, we have light. So where we see something surrounded by light to look like it's shining, or a light is shining on the object. In this case, we have a floating head, and we have a light and a halo behind the head, pulling our attention first to the floating head, and then we look at the rest of the painting. So in this case, we have emphasis happening three different ways in an art piece, but all of them draw our attention to specific points in the canvas first. So next we are going to talk about these three principles of design. More or less, we're going to talk about them together. So we are going to start with harmony, and we're going to look at Cézanne's still life painting here. Harmony is the agreeable blending of elements. So in other words, does everything in the painting look like it belongs together? And harmony can be subjective. So in that case, subjective harmony is, do I think everything looks good together? And then I'm going to use my opinion to determine if the painting is well made or not. We also have objective harmony, to where my opinion more or less doesn't really matter. We listen to what the artist says about the painting and we say, okay, they're saying that these elements go together because of XYZ, and so it goes together. So we have two types of harmony, kind of depending on which artist's art you are looking at. And so in this case, when I'm looking at Cézanne's still life painting, I could say that I see harmony in this painting. We have general items that we would all see on a table. We have the glass bottle, the basket of fruit, those are ladyfinger cookies on a plate. So we have food, we have a plate, a table. Everything looks like it would belong together, and it's all more or less painted in the same style, which we can refer to as unity. Does everything match? We have a similar color palette. We see green used throughout. We see the reds and the oranges used throughout as well. We have a white cloth and a white plate. So we have a sense of wholeness. The whole canvas is used. We have a similar color palette, proximity. Things are put next to each other in a way that makes sense and also helps us guide our eyes as we're following the peaches or apples as they fall out of the basket. And we also see, again, similarity, similar colors, similar style of painting, and continuation. We're following the falling fruit out of the basket with our eyes to look at the canvas as a whole. And last but not least, we also have variety, the diversity of objects or subjects that are in the painting. Are there different things in the painting? Yeah, there's a lot of different things to look at. We have a table, a basket, fruit, cookies, a plate, a glass bottle. We have a variety of objects that we can look at and analyze separately, but they also are united in that they're all similar, they're all placed together that makes sense, and it flows nicely. So to wrap up our video here, we are going to use 2 or more principles of design to analyze Paul Delaroche's The Young Martyr. Right? So remember, for full credit, our critical thinking question answers are 4 more complete sentences. So you want to think about those principles of design that we just reviewed, and what do you see in this painting? What is one principle of design? I think off in the distance I heard emphasis. Yes, very good. Emphasis is one that catches my eye immediately as well. We have the emphasis in the form of, starts with an L, light, right? It looks like there is a light shining on the woman figure that is in the river. We have a halo above her. Her face is painted with a much brighter white to make it look like she is very shiny. And the background in the water is painted with much darker tones and values so that it really does look like she is shining very, very brightly. So we also have, is there another principle of design here? Maybe one that starts with a P? Perspective, right? Or proportion. We can talk about either one of those. So perspective here, we do get a sense of depth in that the woman is painted much larger than the figures that we can see standing on the hill in the background. We also have, does anyone have a last one that we can talk about here? We have a sense of balance. So our balance here is that we have a really dark, if you drew an imaginary line, horizontal. So the woman is underneath the line, and then the black figures in the black hill are above the imaginary line. We have a sense of balance in that while the woman is shining brightly, she is surrounded by this dark water. And if we look above the imaginary line here, we can see that there's a sunset off in the background, right? It creates a sense of balance that we have this bright shining light in the bottom and then a very dull light off in the left-hand side. All right, if you need any more help answering your critical thinking question, please feel free to call, text, email, or Google chat me. I'm looking forward to seeing your work. Thanks everyone for sticking around. Have a good day.